The fastest way to lose respect in a room is to assume you're the smartest person in it. Nobody remembered exactly who said it first. Some claimed it came from an old professor. Others swore it was a Wall Street legend. But on a cold Thursday evening in Manhattan, those words would prove true in a way no one inside the Meridian expected. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble floors. Waiters moved silently between tables. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves. The city's most influential investors, attorneys, and executives filled the private dining room on the top floor. Every seat had been reserved weeks in advance. Every conversation carried the weight of money. At the center of it all sat Jonathan Pierce, billionaire, founder, dealmaker, a man whose opinions could move markets before lunch and change careers before dinner. At 42, Jonathan had built a reputation for being right more often than anyone thought possible. People listened when he spoke. People agreed when he finished. And tonight was no different. A major international partnership was only minutes away from being finalized. The atmosphere buzzed with confidence. Glasses clinked softly. Investors exchanged satisfied smiles. Everything seemed perfectly under control. Claire Bennett moved quietly through the room, carrying a silver coffee pot. Most people never noticed her. That was normal. Waitresses rarely became part of conversations happening around billion-dollar deals. She preferred it that way. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back. Her black uniform matched every other server in the restaurant. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was different from anyone else working that evening. She refilled water glasses, collected empty plates, smiled politely when spoken to. Invisible, professional, forgettable, exactly how the guests saw her. Jonathan stood from his chair and walked toward a large display screen positioned beside the table. Several international executives watched attentively. A contract appeared on the screen. The final document. The last step before signatures. Jonathan pointed confidently toward a specific paragraph. As you can see, he said, his voice calm and certain, this clause guarantees exclusive distribution rights for the next 7 years. Heads nodded around the room. Pens were lifted. The agreement seemed settled. Then something strange happened. One of the foreign executives frowned. Another exchanged a glance with his colleague. A third shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jonathan continued speaking, unaware of the subtle change spreading across the table. Claire noticed it immediately. She had been pouring coffee only a few feet away. Her hand paused for half a second. Her eyes moved from the contract to the executives. Then back again. Something wasn't right. She lowered the coffee pot slowly. Around her, nobody seemed to notice. Jonathan kept explaining the agreement. The guests kept listening. Yet the tension continued building beneath the surface like pressure inside a sealed container. Claire felt it. She read it in their expressions. She heard it in the silence between words. She looked once more toward the screen, then toward Jonathan. For a moment she said nothing. The safe choice was obvious. Continue serving coffee. Keep walking. Let someone else handle it. But something stopped her. Maybe it was principle. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the simple inability to watch a mistake unfold when she knew exactly where it was leading. Jonathan pointed again at the contract. This language is completely straightforward, he said. There's no room for confusion. Claire inhaled quietly. Then she spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough for the people nearest to hear. Actually, sir, she said. That's not what it says. The room froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A fork settled against a plate. Somewhere in the distance. Even the piano seemed to disappear. Jonathan slowly turned toward her. The investors stared. The executives stared. Every eye in the room found the waitress standing beside a coffee cart. Claire didn't flinch. She didn't look embarrassed. She didn't look afraid. She simply looked certain. And for the first time that evening, nobody was paying attention to the billionaire. Jonathan Pierce had spent 2 decades building a reputation that could silence boardrooms with a single sentence. Yet now he stood motionless beside the display screen, staring at a waitress who had just challenged him in front of some of the most influential people in the city. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the executives who had been nodding confidently moments earlier seemed unsure where to look. Claire Bennett remained beside the coffee cart, one hand resting lightly on the silver handle. Her expression did not change. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. That was what made the moment so unsettling. Jonathan studied her for several seconds. Most people rush to explain themselves when confronted by authority. Most people immediately apologized. Claire did neither. She simply waited. Calm, certain, professional. Finally, Jonathan folded his arms. You believe I am wrong? His voice was controlled, but the edge beneath it was impossible to miss. Several guests exchanged nervous glances. Claire met his gaze respectfully. I believe the wording means something different than what was presented, sir. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Nobody liked conflict in rooms where millions of dollars were involved. Jonathan glanced toward the contract displayed on the screen, then back to Claire. And what exactly do you think it means? The question hung in the air. Some expected her confidence to disappear. Others expected her to back down. Instead, Claire looked toward the international executives seated across the table. One of them lowered his eyes and quietly nodded. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but Jonathan saw it. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across his face. The foreign executives had seemed uncomfortable before Claire spoke. Now they appeared curious, interested, waiting. Claire took a careful breath. I think there may be a translation issue involving the exclusivity language. Silence returned. One of the investors frowned. Another reached for the printed contract. Jonathan felt the room slowly shifting beneath him. Not against him. Not yet. But away from certainty. Away from assumptions. He was not accustomed to that feeling. A translation issue, he repeated. Claire nodded. Yes, sir. Jonathan looked toward the legal team seated near the far end of the table. Their expressions suddenly appeared less confident than before. One attorney adjusted his glasses and flipped through several pages. Another leaned closer to the document. Neither immediately spoke. That bothered Jonathan more than Claire's interruption. The attorneys had reviewed the agreement for weeks. They were among the best in the country. If there was a problem, they should have dismissed it instantly. Instead, they seemed to be searching. The room grew warmer. Or perhaps it only felt that way. Claire remained perfectly still. She had not taken another step forward. She had not attempted to dominate the conversation. She simply stood there like someone who knew exactly what she had heard. Jonathan glanced around the table. Every eye had shifted away from him and toward her. He disliked that realization more than he cared to admit. Then one of the international executives spoke for the first time since the interruption. His voice was polite, measured. Perhaps we should hear her explanation. Several heads turned. The suggestion landed heavily across the room. Jonathan looked at the executive, then at Claire, the waitress who had somehow become the center of a billion-dollar discussion. Somewhere behind the dining room doors, dishes clinked softly in the kitchen. A server crossed the hallway carrying a tray. The rest of Manhattan continued moving outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. But inside the private dining room, time seemed to slow. Jonathan noticed something unusual. Claire was not excited by the attention. She was not enjoying the spotlight. If anything, she looked like she wished she were somewhere else entirely. Yet she had still spoken. That detail stayed with him. Most people challenged authority because they wanted recognition. Claire looked like someone who would have preferred invisibility, which meant she had another reason. And reasons like that were rarely simple. Jonathan straightened his jacket and looked directly at her. Very well, he said. Explain what everyone else apparently missed. Around the table, shoulders tightened. Pens stopped moving. Conversations died completely. The challenge had been made. And for the first time all evening, the billionaire was no longer controlling where the night was heading. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Claire could feel dozens of eyes fixed on her, yet her pulse remained surprisingly steady. The attention felt uncomfortable, but not unfamiliar. She had spent years learning how to stay calm when people expected her to fail. Jonathan Pierce stood near the display screen waiting for an answer. The challenge in his voice was obvious. Most people in the room expected Claire to hesitate. Instead, she looked toward the contract. The issue is not the English version, she said carefully. The issue is how the original wording was interpreted before it was translated. Several executives leaned forward. One of the foreign partners exchanged another glance with his colleague. Claire noticed it immediately. It confirmed what she had suspected. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. Go on. Claire took a slow breath. The phrase being referenced does not automatically grant exclusive rights. It creates a priority position under specific conditions. Those conditions are listed later in the agreement. A silence followed. Different this time. Less shock. More calculation. One attorney quickly turned several pages. Another highlighted a section on his tablet. Jonathan remained expressionless, but his attention had sharpened. Claire could see it. He was no longer listening out of irritation. He was listening because he wanted to know whether she was right. Across the room, the lead international executive spoke quietly in his native language to one of his associates. The associate responded immediately. Both men nodded. Claire felt a small knot in her stomach loosen. She knew what that meant. The interpretation was accurate. Yet the room still seemed unable to understand how a waitress had entered a conversation that should have belonged to attorneys, executives, and consultants. Jonathan finally spoke again. You were telling me that our legal team overlooked a condition affecting the entire agreement. Claire shook her head. No, sir. The answer surprised him. Then, what are you saying? I am saying they identified it correctly in the document. But the explanation presented tonight simplified the language in a way that changed the meaning. Several people looked toward the attorneys. The attorneys looked toward the contract. Nobody appeared eager to speak first. Jonathan glanced around the table. He had built companies by recognizing patterns in people. Confidence, fear, competence, deception. At that moment, he noticed something unusual. Claire was not trying to win. She was trying to clarify. There was a difference. People who wanted attention often became emotional when challenged. Claire remained remarkably composed. Her voice never rose. Her posture never changed. She spoke like someone discussing weather forecasts rather than correcting a billionaire in front of half of Manhattan's financial elite. Jonathan found himself unexpectedly curious. Who was she? The question appeared in his mind before he realized it. Because something did not fit. The uniform fit. The name tag fit. The coffee cart fit. Everything else did not. One investor cleared his throat. How would you know something like this? The question came from the far side of the table. Direct. Reasonable. Claire looked toward him. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across her face. Not fear. Something closer to reluctance. She seemed to weigh her answer carefully. Then she offered a small smile. I read contracts. A few people laughed softly. They assumed she was joking. Claire did not laugh. The investor's smile faded. Jonathan noticed that too. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Yellow taxis moved through the streets far below. The city felt enormous, endless. Yet inside the private dining room, the conversation had narrowed to a single woman standing beside a coffee cart. One of the foreign executives suddenly spoke. She is correct. The words landed with surprising force. Every head turned. The executive folded his hands and continued. The original language supports her interpretation. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody argued. The confirmation came from the very people who had drafted the agreement. Jonathan felt a strange sensation settle over the room. Not embarrassment. Not tension. Respect. Quiet respect. And somehow that felt more powerful than either. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, as if hoping the attention would finally move elsewhere. It did not. Because now everyone wanted the answer to the same question. If she was not supposed to be part of this meeting, then how had she understood something that almost everyone else had missed? The question lingered in the room long after anyone spoke it aloud. If she was not supposed to be part of this conversation, then how had she seen what everyone else had missed? Claire felt the weight of the attention settle around her. It was the one thing she had hoped to avoid. For years she had learned that life became simpler when people underestimated her. Expectations stayed low. Questions stayed away. She could do her job, collect her paycheck, and return home without becoming the subject of anyone's curiosity. Tonight had changed that. Jonathan Pierce studied her carefully. He had spent most of his career identifying talent. Not resumes. Not titles. Talent. Real talent often appeared where nobody expected it. A quiet analyst. An overlooked assistant. A founder working from a garage. But never a waitress carrying coffee during a contract negotiation. Yet here they were. One of the attorneys finally cleared his throat. The clarification is accurate, he admitted. The words sounded reluctant. Almost painful. The explanation we presented simplified the language too much. The room absorbed the statement. Several investors leaned back in their chairs. Others reviewed their notes. A few exchanged looks that said exactly the same thing. The waitress had been right. Jonathan glanced toward the screen again. Then toward Claire. You said you read contracts. Yes, sir. How many? A faint smile touched her lips. More than most people would consider enjoyable. A few nervous laughs appeared around the room. Jonathan did not laugh. He was trying to understand her. The answer only created more questions. Why, he asked. Claire hesitated. Her eyes briefly drifted toward the city lights beyond the windows. Manhattan sparkled beneath the night sky like a sea of gold. Because details matter, she said quietly. One sentence can change everything. Something about the way she said it caught Jonathan's attention. It sounded personal, not theoretical, as though experience had taught her that lesson. Before he could ask another question, the lead international executive spoke again. Mr. Pierce, I believe your employee just saved all of us several weeks of confusion. A ripple of amusement moved through the room. Claire immediately shook her head. I am not his employee. Not yet. Someone joked from the far end of the table. More laughter followed. This time Jonathan allowed himself a small smile. Claire did not. She looked almost uncomfortable, as if every additional second of attention made her wish she could disappear into the background again. Jonathan found that strangely refreshing. Most people chased recognition. They wanted credit, visibility, influence. Claire appeared interested in none of those things. The restaurant manager suddenly appeared near the doorway. His face had gone noticeably pale. He had clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand that one of his servers had somehow become involved in a billion-dollar business discussion. Claire, he said cautiously, perhaps we should return to regular service. The suggestion sounded more like a plea. Claire nodded immediately. Of course. She reached for the coffee pot again. The simple motion seemed almost surreal after everything that had happened. One moment, she had been discussing contract language with international executives. The next, she was returning to refill coffee cups. Jonathan watched her carefully. There was no sign of pride, no victory, no attempt to extend the spotlight. She simply resumed her work. Yet the room had changed. Every guest noticed her now. Every movement, every word. A woman who had been invisible less than 10 minutes earlier had somehow become the most interesting person in the building. Claire began moving between tables once more. Calm, efficient, professional. But as she turned away, Jonathan noticed something. A folded leather notebook protruded slightly from the pocket of her apron. The edges were worn from use. Pages filled with notes peeked from the side. It was not something most people would notice. Jonathan did. Because people who carried notebooks like that rarely spent their evenings collecting dinner plates by accident. He watched Claire disappear toward the service station. Then he looked back at the contract displayed on the screen. The deal was still important. The investors were still waiting. Business would continue. Yet his attention kept drifting toward the waitress who had corrected an entire room without raising her voice. And for the first time that evening, Jonathan Pierce was no longer thinking about the agreement. He was thinking about Claire Bennett. The meeting eventually resumed, but it no longer moved with the effortless confidence it had carried earlier that evening. Something had shifted. The contract remained on the screen. The investors continued discussing numbers. The attorneys reviewed language with renewed caution. Yet every few minutes, someone glanced toward the dining room floor where Claire Bennett continued working as if nothing unusual had happened. Jonathan Pierce noticed it too. He answered questions. He reviewed projections. He listened to recommendations. Outwardly, he appeared focused. Internally, however, his attention kept returning to the same question. Who was she? The answer refused to present itself. By every visible measure, Claire was simply a waitress. Yet nothing about her behavior fit that explanation. She had recognized a subtle contractual issue. She had understood the original language. She had spoken with confidence in a room full of experts. Most importantly, she had shown no interest in impressing anyone afterward. That detail bothered Jonathan more than the rest. Ambitious people were predictable. They wanted something. Promotion, recognition, influence. Claire seemed determined to avoid all three. Nearly an hour later, the agreement was finally completed. Signatures were exchanged. Hands were shaken. Relief spread through the room. The evening should have ended there. For most people, it would have. But Jonathan had never built a multi-billion-dollar company by ignoring unanswered questions. Guests slowly began leaving the private dining room. Conversations shifted toward travel plans, market forecasts, and upcoming conferences. Crystal glasses were cleared away. Chairs scraped softly across the floor. Beyond the windows, the city continued glowing beneath the dark sky. Claire was collecting empty dessert plates near the far side of the room when she noticed someone approaching. She looked up. Jonathan Pierce stood a few feet away. Without the audience of investors surrounding him, he appeared different. Still confident, still commanding, but quieter somehow, more thoughtful. Claire immediately straightened. "Can I get you anything, sir?" Jonathan glanced at the tray in her hands. "Just an answer." Claire almost smiled. "Those are usually harder to serve than coffee." To his surprise, Jonathan laughed softly. It was the first genuine laugh he had experienced all evening. "Fair point." For a moment neither spoke. The noise of the restaurant flowed around them. Distant conversations. Soft music. The gentle sound of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. Finally, Jonathan nodded toward the notebook still visible inside her apron pocket. "You carry that everywhere." Claire instinctively looked down. "The notebook?" "Yes." She hesitated. "Most places." "Why?" Her fingers brushed the worn leather cover. "Because memory is unreliable." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "And writing things down is not. Writing forces you to pay attention." The answer came immediately. No hesitation. No performance. Jonathan found himself studying her again. People revealed themselves through small comments more than grand speeches. That answer revealed discipline, curiosity, habit, not luck, not coincidence. "You write contract notes in there?" he asked. Claire laughed quietly. Sometimes. Sometimes language notes. Sometimes observations. Sometimes questions I do not know how to answer yet." Jonathan looked at her for several seconds. The explanation sounded more like something he would hear from a researcher or analyst than a server in a Manhattan restaurant. Before he could continue, Claire glanced toward the service station. Another table needed attention. Work came first. She always made sure of that. "I should get back to my section." Jonathan nodded. "One last question." Claire waited. "Have you always worked here?" The pause that followed lasted slightly too long. Jonathan noticed. So did Claire. "No," she answered carefully. "Not always." It was a simple response, yet it carried the unmistakable feeling of a closed door. Jonathan recognized boundaries when he encountered them. Claire was willing to answer questions, just not certain questions. Not yet. She offered a polite smile. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Mr. Pierce." Then she turned and walked away. Jonathan watched her disappear among the tables. His instincts told him the story was far bigger than she wanted anyone to know. And instincts had served him very well throughout his career. Across the room, one of his senior advisors approached. "Everything all right?" Jonathan glanced toward the service station, where Claire was already helping another guest. Invisible again. Or at least trying to be. "No," Jonathan said thoughtfully. "Everything is interesting." And for the first time in years, a business deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars was no longer the most intriguing thing he had encountered that night. The restaurant closed shortly after midnight. One by one, the remaining guests disappeared into the Manhattan night. Chairs were returned to their places. Candles were extinguished. The polished elegance of the dining room slowly gave way to the quieter rhythm that only restaurant employees ever witnessed. Claire moved through her closing routine with practiced efficiency. Empty glasses, folded linens, inventory notes. Nothing complicated, nothing dramatic. Exactly the way she preferred it. Yet she could still feel the evening lingering around her. Not because she regretted speaking. She did not. If given the choice again, she would make the same decision. The problem was everything that followed. Attention had a way of creating complications. And complications had a way of finding people who were trying to stay invisible. By 12:30, most of the staff had gone home. Claire sat alone at a small table near the back office, her notebook open beside a half-finished cup of tea. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, contract terminology, language comparisons, personal observations, questions, ideas, fragments of articles she wanted to read later. Learning had always been her habit, long before restaurant shifts. Long before Manhattan. Long before life became more complicated than she had planned. She turned a page and began writing a few notes about the agreement from earlier that evening. Not because she expected to revisit it. Simply because details mattered. They always had. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Claire looked up. It was Michael, the night manager. "Still here?" he asked. She smiled. "For another few minutes." Michael glanced at the notebook. "You know, most people watch television after work. I tried that once." "And?" "The notebook won." He laughed. Then his expression grew more serious. "You caused quite a stir tonight." Claire sighed quietly. "That was not the goal." "I know." Michael leaned against the doorway. "Which is probably why people cannot stop talking about it." Claire closed the notebook. I assume that is not good. Actually, it is the opposite. He hesitated. Several guests specifically asked about you before they left. That was exactly the kind of news Claire disliked hearing. She had spent years avoiding unnecessary attention. Attention created expectations. Expectations created questions. And questions eventually reached places she preferred to keep private. Michael seemed to sense her concern. Relax. Nobody is investigating you. Claire raised an eyebrow. That is a strangely specific reassurance. Michael laughed again. Fair point. After he left, the restaurant grew quiet once more. Claire slipped the notebook back into her bag and gathered her things. Outside, the air was cool and crisp. The streets shimmered beneath reflections of neon signs and office towers. Manhattan never truly slept. It simply changed pace. Claire walked toward the subway entrance 3 blocks away. She enjoyed this part of the night. The city felt different after midnight. Less rushed. More honest somehow. People stopped performing success and simply became tired human beings trying to get home. As she descended the station stairs, her phone vibrated. A message appeared from an unknown number. Claire frowned. Very few people had her personal number. She opened the message cautiously. It contained only one sentence. You were right tonight. No name. No signature. Nothing else. Claire stared at the screen. Then another message appeared a few seconds later. Most people would have stayed silent. This time she recognized the sender immediately. Jonathan Pierce. She should not have been surprised. Somehow she still was. Claire looked at the message for several seconds. The simplest choice would be to ignore it. That would be the safest option. Clean. Professional. Final. Yet something about the words felt sincere. Not arrogant. Not demanding. Just honest. She typed a short response. Most people probably had more to lose. She pressed send before she could reconsider. The train arrived moments later. Doors opened. Passengers stepped inside. Claire slipped her phone into her coat pocket and found an empty seat near the window. Across the city, in an office overlooking the Hudson River, Jonathan Pierce read her reply twice. Then a third time. Slowly, a thoughtful smile appeared. Because for the second time that day, Claire Bennett had given him an answer he had not expected. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale winter sunlight that reflected from the glass towers of Midtown Manhattan. Claire Bennett was already halfway through her shift before she thought about the text message again. Customers came and went. Coffee cups were filled. Orders were delivered. On the surface, the day looked exactly like every other day. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind lingered the unusual realization that one of the most powerful businessmen in the country now possessed her phone number. She was still deciding whether that was amusing or concerning. Around 11 o'clock, the lunch crowd began arriving. The restaurant quickly filled with attorneys, executives, consultants, and tourists hoping to experience one of Manhattan's most exclusive dining rooms. Claire moved efficiently between tables, balancing plates and conversations with practiced ease. Then Michael appeared beside her station. You have a visitor. Claire frowned. A visitor? Michael nodded toward the entrance. Claire followed his gaze and nearly stopped walking. Jonathan Pierce stood near the hostess stand. Not surrounded by assistants. Not accompanied by investors. Alone. He wore a dark navy overcoat and carried a slim leather portfolio beneath one arm. Several employees immediately recognized him. A few whispered to one another. Jonathan appeared completely unaware of the attention. His eyes were focused on Claire. She walked toward him cautiously. Mr. Pierce. Claire. His expression softened slightly. Good morning. What brings you here? Jonathan glanced around the busy restaurant. That is a reasonable question. Claire folded her arms lightly. I have those occasionally. A brief smile appeared, then disappeared. Jonathan held up the portfolio. I was hoping you could help me settle an argument. Claire stared at him. An argument? A professional one. Those are usually the expensive kind. Exactly. For a moment she wondered if he was joking. The problem was that she could not quite tell. Jonathan seemed to enjoy existing somewhere between sincerity and amusement. You came all the way here because of an argument? She asked. No. He paused. I came because I trust your judgment. The answer caught her off guard. Not because it sounded flattering. Because it sounded genuine. Claire looked away briefly. Compliments rarely impressed her. Honest observations were harder to dismiss. Jonathan noticed her reaction. That expression tells me you are uncomfortable. Most people do not trust waitresses with business questions. Most waitresses do not correct international contracts. Before Claire could respond, a customer signaled for assistance from across the dining room. She glanced toward the table. Duty first. Always. Jonathan followed her gaze and nodded. Work comes before curiosity. I understand. Claire blinked. Few people understood that. Fewer respected it. Give me 10 minutes, she said. Jonathan smiled. I can wait. He chose a quiet table near the window and sat down. No demands. No special treatment. No attempt to pull rank. Several employees watched the scene unfold with growing confusion. A billionaire waiting patiently for a waitress was not something they saw every day. 10 minutes later, Claire returned carrying a glass of water. Jonathan looked up from the portfolio. Thank you. For the water? For not making me wait 15. She sat across from him only after confirming her section was under control. Jonathan opened the portfolio and removed several printed pages. Claire glanced down. Charts. Financial summaries. Research notes. Serious material. Not casual conversation. What am I looking at? She asked. Jonathan slid the papers across the table. A proposal everyone in my company agrees with. Claire studied the first page. Then the second. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Jonathan recognized the expression immediately. It was the same expression she had worn before speaking up during the contract meeting. The same quiet focus. The same attention to detail. He leaned back and waited. Several moments passed. Finally, Claire looked up. You want my honest opinion? Jonathan nodded. That is the only reason I am here. Claire closed the folder slowly. Outside the window, the city continued rushing forward. Inside the restaurant, neither of them noticed. Because once again, Claire Bennett had found something that nobody else seemed to see. Claire looked down at the proposal again. The pages were impressive. Detailed research. Strong projections. Endorsements from experienced analysts. The kind of document most executives would approve after a quick review. Yet something felt off. Not wrong exactly. Incomplete. Jonathan watched her carefully. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Claire remained silent. Most people became uncomfortable with silence. Jonathan had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than conversation. Finally, Claire placed the papers on the table. The numbers are good, she said. That is what everyone keeps telling me. The research is thorough. Another popular opinion. Claire tapped a page near the middle of the proposal. The assumptions are the problem. Jonathan leaned forward. Explain. Claire turned the document around so he could see a highlighted section. Every forecast here assumes consumer behavior remains stable for the next 3 years. Jonathan nodded. That is standard modeling. Yes. Claire paused. Which is exactly why everyone uses it. A faint smile appeared on Jonathan's face. He already knew what was coming. Claire had found something. Go on. She pointed towards several charts. The data is accurate. The trend analysis is accurate. The market opportunity is probably accurate. Probably. Nobody can predict people with complete accuracy. Jonathan laughed quietly. Fair. Claire folded her hands. The proposal assumes customers will behave logically. Do they not? Sometimes. Her answer came instantly. But people are emotional before they are logical. Jonathan stared at her. That was not the response of a waitress reviewing a business plan. That was the response of someone who understood markets. Human behavior. Risk. The deeper forces hidden beneath spreadsheets. Claire continued. Everyone involved in this proposal studied numbers. And did anyone study customers? Jonathan looked down at the report. For the first time, uncertainty entered his expression. Not because her argument was dramatic. Because it was simple. Simple observations were often the most dangerous. They exposed flaws hidden beneath complexity. Claire flipped to another page. This section predicts adoption rates. Correct. Based on historical performance. Yes. What happens if customer priorities change? Jonathan did not answer immediately. Claire already knew why. The proposal contained hundreds of pages discussing financial risks, regulatory risks, supply chain risks, competitive risks, yet very little discussion about changing human priorities. She gently closed the folder. I think everyone became so focused on proving the idea could succeed that they stopped asking how it could fail. The words settled between them. Around them, lunch service continued. Plates arrived. Conversations flowed. Silverware clinked softly against fine china. Yet at the small table by the window, neither seemed aware of any of it. Jonathan slowly leaned back in his chair. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not because he agreed. Not because he disagreed. Because she had done it again. She had looked at the same information everyone else had reviewed and found a question nobody had asked. Do you know something? He said. Claire raised an eyebrow. What? You are becoming very expensive. She laughed despite herself. The sound surprised both of them. Jonathan shook his head. My entire executive team reviewed this proposal. I am sure they are very qualified. They are. He nodded. And yet you found the first question that actually worries me. Claire glanced toward the dining room. A customer needed a refill. Another table was ready to order. Reality was waiting. You should probably talk to your analysts. Jonathan stood, gathering the papers. I will. He paused. But first I am going to ask them why a waitress keeps doing their job better than they do. Claire immediately shook her head. Do not do that. Why not? Because they worked hard. Jonathan looked genuinely surprised. Most people would have enjoyed the comparison. Claire seemed uncomfortable with it. You are defending them? I am saying they saw something valuable. She shrugged lightly. I just happened to see something else. Jonathan studied her for several seconds. Then he realized what made her different. She never treated intelligence like a competition. She treated it like a responsibility. The distinction was subtle, but powerful. And as he walked toward the exit carrying the proposal under one arm, Jonathan Pierce found himself thinking that the most remarkable thing about Claire Bennett was not how much she knew. It was how little she cared about proving it. 3 weeks passed. Winter settled deeper over Manhattan. Holiday lights appeared in storefront windows. Steam drifted from subway grates into the cold evening air. Life moved forward. At least that was what Claire told herself. She had not heard much from Jonathan Pierce since their conversation about the proposal. A few brief messages. A thank you. An occasional question. Nothing more. Which suited her perfectly. The less attention, the better. Then on a Thursday afternoon, Michael hurried across the restaurant carrying his phone. Claire, he said, you might want to see this. She frowned. What happened? Michael turned the screen toward her. A business article filled the display. The headline referenced one of Jonathan's largest upcoming investments. Claire recognized the project immediately. The same proposal she had reviewed at the restaurant. The article explained that the company had unexpectedly delayed the launch after identifying several strategic concerns during final evaluation. Claire read the paragraph twice. Then a small smile appeared. Looks like they found the questions. Michael blinked. You knew about this? Not exactly. She handed the phone back. I just thought they should take another look. Michael stared at her, then shook his head and walked away laughing. One day, he said, I am going to figure out who you really are. Claire smiled but said nothing. Because the truth was complicated. Not mysterious. Just complicated. Later that evening, the restaurant hosted another private event. Investors. Executives. Attorneys. Different names. Same expensive suits. Same conversations. Claire moved through the dining room, carrying trays and refilling glasses. Near 7 o'clock, the room suddenly grew quieter. Not silent, just noticeably quieter. She looked toward the entrance. Jonathan Pierce had arrived. Several guests immediately approached him. Handshakes followed. Introductions. Business discussions. The usual routine surrounding powerful people. Claire returned to work. 10 minutes later, she felt someone stop beside her station. Jonathan. Good evening, he said. Good evening. Did you see the article? Claire nodded. I did. You were right. She sighed softly. There is that phrase again. Jonathan smiled. You do not seem to enjoy hearing it. Because it is usually the wrong lesson. Jonathan looked curious. What is the right lesson? Claire set down the coffee pot. For a moment, she considered her answer. Around them, conversations continued. Glasses reflected warm light from the chandeliers. Beyond the windows, Manhattan glowed against the dark sky. Finally, she spoke. The goal was never to be right. Jonathan waited. Claire continued. The goal was to pay attention. The words settled between them. Simple. Honest. True. Jonathan slowly nodded. For perhaps the first time in his life, he understood exactly what she meant. Success had taught him to speak. Power had taught him to lead. Wealth had taught him to influence. Yet somewhere along the way, he had forgotten how valuable it was to listen. Really listen. To details. To people. To voices everyone else ignored. He looked around the room. Hundreds of conversations. Dozens of accomplished professionals. Then he looked back at Claire Bennett, the waitress who had changed the direction of a major business decision simply by asking a better question. Would you ever consider working for me? He asked quietly. Claire smiled. Not surprised. Not flattered. Just amused. There it is. Jonathan laughed. I had to ask. And I have to decline. Why? Claire glanced around the restaurant. Because this is where I am supposed to be right now. Most people would have called that answer foolish. Jonathan did not. He had learned enough to recognize conviction when he heard it. He extended his hand. Claire looked at it briefly before shaking it. No contracts. No negotiations. No audience. Just mutual respect. Thank you, Jonathan said. Claire tilted her head. For what? He smiled. For reminding me that intelligence does not announce itself. It just shows up when it matters. Claire released his hand and returned to work. Jonathan walked back toward his table. The conversations resumed. The evening continued. Yet something had changed. Not in the restaurant. Not in the city. In the people who had witnessed the story unfold. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is not the one holding the microphone. Sometimes it is the quiet person paying attention while everyone else is busy being heard.